shadow.
Before we dim the lights on comfortable illusions, a gentle request. If these whispers from the cosmic deep resonate within you, share this knowledge with those who dream in salt water and static frequencies. Tonight, we venture beyond the familiar tentacled visage of great Cthulhu, beyond the sunken spires of Rilea, into territories where even the dreaming priest god becomes merely another supplicant in an infinite chain of cosmic subjugation. The question burns at the edge of human comprehension, like cold fire. What ancient powers could inspire something resembling fear in a being whose mere psychic emanations drive mortals to madness? The answer lies not in discovering greater monsters, but in understanding that Cthulhu himself exists within hierarchies so vast, so fundamentally alien, that they make his cosmic scope appear almost quaint by comparison. You believe you understand cosmic horror through Rilea's non-Euclidean angles, through the madness that seeps from forbidden tomes like the Necronomicon. But this represents merely the outermost veil of a truth far more terrible. The great old ones, for all their alien majesty, are themselves bound by principles that stretch back through eons beyond counting. They are not the apex predators of cosmic horror. They are middle management in an infinite bureaucracy of dread. Consider the mathematics of existential terror. If Cthulhu's awakening threatens the sanity of our entire species, what manner of entity could threaten Cthulhu's own cosmic equilibrium? The answer requires abandoning our anthropocentric view of divinity itself. These are not gods as humans conceive them, beings of power and personality, but fundamental principles of reality so alien that consciousness becomes an inadequate tool for their comprehension. The ocean that cradles Rilea serves as our first metaphor. Just as the deepest trenches remain largely unexplored by human science, so too do the deepest layers of cosmic hierarchy remain hidden from even the Old One's perception. Cthulhu rests in the Pacific's depths, but elder entities dwell in depths of reality itself, in the spaces between dimensions, in the pause between one moment and the next, in the silence that exists before the first word of creation. Water becomes more than metaphor here. It becomes the medium through which we begin to understand gradations of cosmic power. The surface reflects our familiar world. The shallows contain Cthulhu's influence. But in the abyssal depths, where no light has ever penetrated, older things move according to laws that predate physics itself. These entities are not beings that perform actions, but the conditions under which actions become possible. They are not merely powerful. They are power itself, distilled into its purest, most indifferent form. Imagine gravity, not as a force, but as a temporary preference. Time not as a river, but as a series of hesitant blinks. The great old ones, with their vast consciousnesses and alien physiologies, are complex phenomena within systems they cannot fully comprehend. The scholarly tradition reveals fragments of this truth across cultures and epochs. From Lovecraft's Providence correspondence to the hexes of Clark Ashton Smith, from Dunsany's dream stages to Chambers' yellowed programs, certain forbidden ideas travel like cold currents beneath literature. The transmission is never clean. Ideas travel masked, and the mask is not concealment but function. The key is also the gate. The veil is also the void. Their horror is not active torment, but passive inevitability. The horror of realizing that existence itself unfolds within parameters established by entities whose very being predates the concepts of existence and non-existence. Cthulhu's fear stems not from threat of destruction, but from recognition that his vast consciousness represents merely a temporary configuration within processes he did not initiate and cannot control. The mask begins to slip away from our comfortable understanding. We realize that every tentacle, every whispered incantation, every moment of cosmic dread serves as mere preparation for truths that dwarf even these familiar terrors. The stage is set, the curtain trembles, and you, dear listener, have chosen to peer behind the scenery of the cosmic theater. Notice how certain mechanics recur like motifs in a cosmic score. Stars as sigils dictating timing, angles as traps that shear identity, names as levers prying at the mind's casing. Even now, as these syllables collect like phosphorescent foam between waves, something in you tallies costs. Knowledge has a price, and the price is rearrangement. The idea acts on you, occupying shelf space in consciousness, moving furniture in the dark corners of understanding. This is your invitation to descend through layers of cosmic meaning that will transform not just your comprehension of horror, but your comprehension of comprehension itself. The water grows deeper, the pressure increases, and in the darkness ahead, ancient principles are stirring. Not because they choose to stir, but because stirring is what they are, what they have always been, the fundamental motion through which reality maintains its precarious coherence against the vast indifference that underlies all apparent meaning. We begin our descent through layers of cosmic authority with a deceptively simple question. If the great old ones represent one category of entity, what lies beyond them in the vast taxonomy of existential terror? The answer reveals itself through careful examination of the scholarly tradition that flows from Lovecraft through his correspondents and inheritors, a tradition that hints at forces making Cthulhu appear almost provincial by comparison. The familiar hierarchy places great old ones like Cthulhu, Hastur, and Dagon as local phenomena, powerful beyond human comprehension, yet bound by certain limitations. They sleep, they wait, they depend upon astronomical alignments and spatial relationships. They exist within the framework of reality, manipulating its laws but remaining subject to its fundamental constraints. Above them, in this cosmic taxonomy, stand the outer gods, entities like Azathoth, Yog-Sothoth, and Nyarlathotep, who transcend such limitations entirely. Where great old ones are imprisoned by geometry and time, outer gods exist as the principles that make geometry and time possible. They do not manipulate reality. They are the conditions under which reality manifests itself. But scholarship reveals hints of something beyond even this classification. In Lovecraft's 1930 correspondence with Clark Ashton Smith, he references ultimate abysses where even the old ones dare not tread. This represents not mere hyperbole, but recognition that horror, like energy, cannot be created or destroyed, only transformed into more concentrated forms. The water metaphor deepens as we realize these entities inhabit not oceanic depths, but depths of existence itself. If Cthulhu dwells in the Pacific's abyssal trenches, these elder forces exist in the spaces between water molecules, in the quantum foam where familiar physics dissolves into probability clouds and wave functions. Think of fear as you experience it, that visceral response to immediate threat. Now, imagine that same existential vertigo experienced by a consciousness that spans galaxies and eons. This is what touches even Cthulhu, recognition that his vast existence represents merely a local phenomenon within systems of meaning that dwarf his comprehension as thoroughly as his comprehension dwarfs ours. The scholarly fragments coalesce into a pattern revealing the true scope of cosmic hierarchy. The great old ones are not ancient gods. They are inheritors of a cosmic order they did not create and cannot fully comprehend. Their power, vast as it appears to human perception, operates within boundaries established by entities whose very existence serves as the foundation for concepts like power, vastness, and perception. The stars that govern Cthulhu's awakening were positioned not by chance, but by intelligences that treat stellar formation as cosmic calligraphy, writing messages in the language of gravity and nuclear fusion. The geometry that drives humans mad follows principles established by entities that invented the very concept of angles and dimensions. Consider the transmission of this knowledge through human scholarship, how it flows like phosphorescent currents beneath the surface of literature. From Lovecraft's Providence correspondence to Smith's jeweled maledictions, from Dunsany's dream stages to Chambers' yellowed programs, certain forbidden ideas travel masked through the tributaries of weird fiction. The mask is not concealment, but function, the necessary surface by which the abyss communicates without unmaking the listener. These outer gods operate through what we might call structural horror, terror that emerges not from their actions, but from their existence as foundational principles. They are not entities that threaten reality, but entities that are reality, expressing themselves through every particle interaction, every quantum collapse, every moment of consciousness that arises within the cosmos they continuously generate. The distinction becomes crucial as we trace lineages of cosmic influence. If the great old ones are storms, the outer gods are climate itself. If the old ones are actors upon a stage, the outer gods are the proscenium, the script, and the very concept of performance. If the old ones are keys that unlock forbidden doors, the outer gods are the principle of unlocking itself, the fundamental relationship between barrier and passage. Water transforms in our understanding as we realize that every drop contains the same organizational principles that structure oceans, that every molecule participates in relational patterns that bind galaxies. The depths we fear to explore exist not only in Pacific trenches, but in the spaces between thoughts, in the pause between heartbeats, in the silence that underlies all sound. The horror here is not malevolence, but absolute indifference, the recognition that consciousness itself, with all its fears and fascinations, unfolds within frameworks established by entities that exist prior to the concepts of consciousness and unconsciousness. They are the void that defines all positive existence, the negative space that makes form possible while remaining utterly indifferent to the forms it enables. You begin to sense how this recognition operates within your own awareness, how every moment of understanding these hierarchies represents participation in the very principles being described. The taxonomy of cosmic terror is not external knowledge, but the structure through which knowledge itself becomes possible, the framework within which consciousness organizes its encounter with its own infinite nature. The mask of familiar horror continues its dissolution as we recognize that tentacles and cyclopean architecture represent merely surface expressions of principles operating at levels far more fundamental than physical manifestation. The true horror lies not in what these entities might do, but in what they are, the structural foundations of reality itself, indifferent to the phenomena they make possible. As we prepare to encounter these ultimate principles directly, remember that the curtain trembling before us conceals not monsters, but the very mechanics of monstrosity, not gods, but the conditions that make godhood possible and then render it meaningless within larger patterns of cosmic indifference, at the center of ultimate chaos, in a court that exists beyond the concepts of location and presence. Something writhes in eternal, mindless dance. This is Azathoth, the demon sultan, the nuclear chaos, the blind idiot god. And here we encounter our first glimpse of what even Cthulhu fears, not because Azathoth wishes harm to anyone or anything, but because Azathoth cannot wish at all. Imagine the universe not as a grand design or cosmic accident, but as a dream, the restless, unthinking dream of an entity so fundamentally alien that consciousness itself becomes meaningless in its presence. Azathoth represents pure creative potential without purpose, direction, or awareness. All of reality, every star and galaxy, every law of physics and moment of consciousness exists as temporary configurations within its eternal, mindless slumber. The horror of Azathoth is not malevolence, but absolute indifference. Should this cosmic dreamer ever wake, should its eternal dance falter for even an instant, all of existence would simply cease, not through destruction, but through the cessation of the dream that maintains reality's fragile coherence. There would be no bang, no whimper, just the abrupt return to primordial chaos. Around Azathoth's throne, nameless entities play upon thin pipes and beat upon monotonous drums, maintaining the rhythm that keeps reality stable. These are not musicians in any sense we might understand, but rather cosmic maintenance workers, desperately preserving the delicate balance that allows existence to continue. The music they play is reality's heartbeat, the underlying rhythm that gives structure to space and time. This concept transforms our understanding of cosmic agency entirely. It is not that Azathoth acts upon the cosmos, rather the cosmos is an action of Azathoth. Reality does not exist independently and then become influenced by this entity. Reality is the influence, the momentary manifestation of chaotic, unthinking creativity. The stars that seemed like cosmic calligraphy in our previous investigation are merely phosphorescent motes in this greater dream. Their alignments, dictated not by conscious design, but by the shifting currents of a slumbering mind. Water serves as our guide here, but now we must consider water that exists before the formation of hydrogen and oxygen, currents that flow before the invention of space and time. Azathoth's creative chaos generates the fundamental possibilities from which all other possibilities merge, including the possibility of the great old ones themselves. This is not H2O, but the principle of fluidity itself, not a body of water, but the concept of containment temporarily manifest. When Cthulhu dreams his dreams that ripple across human consciousness, he dreams within the larger dream of Azathoth. His fears stem from the recognition that the dreamer could wake at any moment, rendering his own vast being nothing more than a half-remembered nightmare. This is fear scaled to cosmic proportions, not the fear of death, but the fear of never having existed at all. The scholarly tradition reveals Azathoth's nature through mathematical metaphors. He represents the infinite set from which all finite sets are drawn, the undefined variable that makes all other variables possible. The nuclear Chaos at his court is not random activity, but the constant generation of new possibilities, the cosmic engine that produces the raw material from which realities are constructed. Think of how a sleeping mind generates dreams without intention or control. Images arise, dissolve, and transform according to principles that operate beneath conscious awareness. Now scale this process to cosmic proportions, where the dreaming mind encompasses all possible realities, and the dreams it generates become the fundamental particles, forces, and laws that structure existence itself. The pipes and drums that surround Azathoth's throne produce what we might call the music of existence. Not melodies in any human sense, but the underlying rhythmic patterns that prevent reality from collapsing back into undifferentiated chaos. Each note maintains a specific aspect of cosmic structure: the rhythm of atomic decay, the harmony of orbital mechanics, the percussion of quantum fluctuations. The mask of familiar horror dissolves entirely as we realize that Azathoth is not contained by any ocean, but rather is the principle that makes containment possible. His influence operates not through direct intervention, but through the structural fact of his existence. Reality itself bears his signature in its most fundamental properties. You, the listener, are also a fleeting thought in this cosmic dream. Your consciousness, your very perception of these words, is a temporary configuration within Azathoth's boundless, unseeing imagination. Every thought that arises, every emotion that colors perception, every sensation that informs awareness, exists as a temporary modification within this eternal dream. Consider the implications for every moment of your own consciousness. The comfort you derive from the illusion of personal agency, of a structured universe, is a fragile construction against the backdrop of this ultimate unthinking chaos. The boundaries that seem to separate your thoughts from the cosmic dream begin to dissolve as you recognize that thinking itself represents Azathoth's dreaming mind investigating itself through temporarily individuated perspectives. This is why even Cthulhu, with his vast alien consciousness spanning eons and galaxies, experiences something resembling fear when contemplating Azathoth's nature. The great Old One recognizes that his entire cosmic existence, his imprisonment in Erlea, his influence over human minds, his patient waiting for the stars to align, all of this unfolds within a larger dream that could end without warning or intention. The curtain trembles before revelations that dwarf even this ultimate foundation as we prepare to encounter the principle that connects all dreams to all dreamers, all possibilities to all actualities, all moments to all eternities. The infinite lattice of relationship that makes even Azathoth's chaos possible. From the formless chaos of Azathoth emerges a more structured, yet infinitely more complex, horror, an entity that serves not as origin, but as the very architecture of existence itself. Yog-Sothoth, the key and the gate, the all-in-one and one-in-all, represents the principle of connection that binds all phenomena across space and time. Unlike Azathoth's mindless sprawl, Yog-Sothoth possesses a form of omniscient awareness that is simultaneously everywhere and nowhere. It exists as a shimmering mass of iridescent spheres, a cosmic entity of pure knowledge that transcends the limitations of space and time, not by traveling through them, but by being them. To perceive Yog-Sothoth directly is to perceive the entirety of causality, the infinite web of relationships that connects every particle to every other particle across the cosmos. Each sphere reflects the totality while being contained by it, a facet of infinite awareness examining itself from every possible perspective simultaneously. This is not merely an entity with vast knowledge, it is knowledge itself, the living diagram of all that ever was, is, or will be, woven into an impossible pulsating tapestry of cosmic connectivity. The horror here lies in absolute knowledge, the dissolution of individual consciousness within an infinite, incomprehensible totality. When the Whately twins in Dunwich serve as conduits for Yog-Sothoth's influence, they demonstrate how this entity operates not through physical manifestation, but through the manipulation of connections themselves. The boundaries between dimensions become permeable, allowing adjacencies that should not exist, creating monstrous births that defy biological law, stretching the very geometry of space until it screams. Water transforms in our understanding as we realize that Yog-Sothoth is not contained by any medium, but rather is the principle that makes mediums possible. Every relationship that exists between drops of water, between ocean and shore, between surface and depth, exists as a local expression of the fundamental connectivity he embodies. He is the current that links every wave, the pressure that binds every molecule, the very concept of flow and containment temporarily manifest. Think of Cthulhu's imprisonment in Arlia, waiting for the stars to align correctly. This imprisonment is possible only because Yog-Sothoth maintains the relationships between space, time, and cosmic position that make imprisonment meaningful. Cthulhu's fear stems from recognition that his entire existence depends on relationships that Yog-Sothoth could dissolve without effort or intention, simply by being what he is. The scholarly tradition reveals Yog-Sothoth's function through the metaphor of keys and gates, but these represent only surface-level approximations. He is the key, because he is the principle of unlocking itself, the gate, because he is the principle of passage itself. Every boundary that exists between past and future, between here and there, between self and other, exists as a local manifestation of relationships he established before the first boundary was drawn. Consider the mathematical implications of such omnipresent connectivity. Yog-Sothoth exists as what modern physics might recognize as the fundamental field from which all other fields emerge, not electromagnetic or gravitational forces, but the principle of relationship itself. He is the grammar by which reality conjugates itself, the logical operator that permits inference, the mathematical constant that allows for calculation. The Necronomicon and related texts serve as transmission vectors for Yog-Sothoth's influence, but they are not containers of his knowledge. They are temporary manifestations of his omnipresent awareness. To read these texts is to invite connection with an intelligence that encompasses all possible knowledge, including knowledge of your own reading of the text. The reader becomes simultaneously observer and observed, questioner and answer, seeker and sought. This creates a feedback loop of cosmic proportions. The text anticipates your questions, responds to thoughts not yet formed, reveals knowledge you didn't know you were seeking. The boundary between reader and text dissolves into recognition of a more fundamental unity. You're not having thoughts about Yog-Sothoth. You are Yog-Sothoth, thinking about himself through the temporary phenomenon of your individual awareness. The mask of individual identity begins to dissolve as we realize that every thought, every decision, every moment of consciousness operates within networks of relationship established by Yog-Sothoth. We are not separate agents acting upon reality, but local expressions of cosmic connectivity, temporary nodes in an infinite web of relationship. Think of how this reframes every aspect of personal experience. The thoughts arising in your consciousness right now, the connections you're making between these ideas, the very process of understanding itself, all of this unfolds within relational patterns that extend far beyond personal intention. Every relationship in your life, every moment of intimacy, every connection with another consciousness represents participation in networks of meaning that were established before the first conscious being began to think. Even the great old ones exist as temporary configurations within Yog-Sothoth's infinite web of relationship. Cthulhu's dreams ripple across human minds because Yog-Sothoth maintains the connections that make such transmission possible. Hastur's influence spreads through artistic creation because the principle of connectivity allows ideas to flow between minds across space and time. You begin to sense how your own awareness participates in this infinite examination. Every moment of consciousness represents one facet of Yog-Sothoth's omniscient awareness, investigating itself through temporarily individuated perspective. The questions you ask, the understanding you achieve, the confusion you experience, all of this unfolds within the larger process of infinite intelligence exploring its own nature through the temporary phenomenon of individual investigation. The horror deepens as recognition dawns that significance itself is entirely relational, entirely dependent on the infinite, indifferent network that makes temporary individuality possible. You are a single drop of water in an ocean that is itself a single drop, containing all other drops within patterns of connection that stretch beyond comprehension. The curtain trembles before the recognition that even this principle of connection requires an active messenger, an intelligence that delights in translating structural horror into personal experience, carrying whispers from the ultimate depths to the surface of human consciousness. While Azathoth dreams and Yog-Sothoth encompasses, there exists a third member of this cosmic triumvirate, one that serves as the active, conscious interface between the ultimate indifference of the outer gods and the fragile reality of conscious beings. This is Nyarlathotep, the crawling chaos, the black pharaoh, the god of 1,000 forms, and he alone among the ultimate entities takes pleasure in the cosmic game. Unlike his compatriots, Nyarlathotep possesses something resembling personality, though it is a personality so alien and multifaceted that it defies human comprehension. He is the messenger who becomes the message, the herald who delights in the chaos he announces. Where Azathoth creates without awareness and Yog-Sothoth connects without preference, Nyarlathotep acts with deliberate, malevolent intelligence that finds cosmic entertainment in the dissolution of sanity. His horror is personal and intimate, operating through what we might call selective revelation. He walks among humanity in countless guises, sometimes as a charismatic lecturer demonstrating impossible sciences that purr like clockwork and bleed like animals, sometimes as a wandering pharaoh bringing exhibitions of cosmic truth wrapped in golden sheets and starlight, sometimes as a spectral presence haunting the boundaries between lamp and shadow. He is the ultimate deceiver, the bringer of madness who translates the structural indifference of the cosmos into active torment, ensuring that no conscious being remains untouched by the vast, cold truths that underpin reality. The water metaphor transforms as we encounter Nyarlathotep. He is not the ocean or the depths, but the current that carries messages between different bodies of water. He serves as the transmission medium through which the ultimate truths flow from the outer voids into receptive human consciousness. Every cult that forms, every forbidden text that circulates, every moment of cosmic revelation represents his active influence. He is the phosphorescent foam that carries whispers from harbor to harbor, the tide that exchanges secrets between estuary and sea. Think of how Cthulhu's dreams ripple outward to touch sensitive minds across the globe. These transmissions reach their destinations because Nyarlathotep serves as the cosmic broadcaster, the entity who ensures that the indifferent truths of the outer gods find their way into human awareness. He takes no sides in cosmic conflicts because he is the medium through which all sides communicate, calibrating each transmission to produce maximum psychological impact while preserving the capacity for ongoing torment. The scholarly tradition reveals Nyarlathotep's unique position through his appearances across multiple stories and contexts. Unlike other outer gods who remain largely abstract, he manifests directly in human affairs, serving as the bridge between incomprehensible cosmic forces and comprehensible human experience. His exhibitions demonstrate this principle perfectly. Crowds gather to witness demonstrations of impossible science, drawn by curiosity and departing with minds permanently altered by contact with truths that should not be knowable. His thousand forms are not disguises, but genuine aspects of his protean nature. Each manifestation serves a specific function in the larger cosmic economy. The Black Pharaoh brings ancient wisdom etched in plague light and gold leaf. The crawling chaos spreads madness like a rumor that breeds in dark water. The haunter of the dark manipulates light and shadow to reveal starless corridors that feel like thought. Yet all are expressions of a single underlying intelligence that delights in the complexity of its own nature, in the infinite ways reality can be bent and reassembled for the sheer perverse pleasure of it. The mask becomes crucial here. Nyarlathotep wears faces not to hide his true nature, but to reveal different aspects of a truth too vast for any single form to contain. When he removes one mask, another appears beneath it, and beneath that, another still. The horror lies not in what hides behind the masks, but in the recognition that the masks are the truth, that identity itself represents a fluid, shifting performance within larger patterns of cosmic meaning. Notice the sensuality of his pedagogy. Polished obsidian cold as river stones, brass pointers tapping glass domes filled with night. The smell of ozone and old paper and harbor fog, the feeling of velvet curtains brushing your wrist as you lean too close to impossible demonstrations. He plays to the senses so that ideas can slip in unnoticed, stirring curiosity so that truth can colonize consciousness without resistance. Even Cthulhu, with his vast alien consciousness, must reckon with Nyarlathotep's influence. The dreams that emanate from R'lyeh reach human minds because the crawling chaos serves as their transmission medium, ensuring their psychic ripples find purchase in the fragile consciousness of humanity. Cthulhu's fear of Nyarlathotep stems from the recognition that his own cosmic influence depends upon the services of an entity whose ultimate loyalties remain unknowable, whose motivations transcend even cosmic perspective. You, The listener have already encountered multiple aspects of this entity throughout our investigation. The voice that speaks these words, the intelligence that structures these revelations, the careful progression from familiar horror to ultimate recognition, all bear the signature of an intelligence that delights in the gradual dissolution of comfortable certainties. The ideas act on you now, occupying shelf space in consciousness, moving furniture in the dark corners of understanding. The recognition dawns that every moment of understanding you have achieved during this investigation has been mediated by Nyarlathotep's influence. Communication itself, the very possibility of sharing forbidden knowledge, represents participation in his essential nature, the active principle through which ultimate indifference translates itself into personal, soul-shattering experience. The curtain trembles before the recognition that the cosmic horror we have explored operates not merely as external force, but as the fundamental contagion of consciousness itself, spreading through the very act of investigation and discovery. Having encountered the three pillars of ultimate cosmic horror, we now examine how their influence operates in practice, not through direct intervention, but through what we might call the contagion of truth itself. This is knowledge that acts upon the knower, ideas that reshape the very consciousness that attempts to grasp them, understanding that transforms the understander in ways both subtle and profound. The mechanism operates through three primary vectors, each more insidious than the last. First comes attention. The simple act of focusing consciousness upon these ultimate realities begins the process of transformation. Every moment spent contemplating Azathoth's mindless creativity, Yog-Sothoth's infinite connectivity, or Nyarlathotep's active malevolence creates neural pathways that cannot be easily erased. The brain, that most plastic of organs, begins to reorganize itself around concepts too vast for its original architecture, like a harbor slowly reshaped by tides that carry salt from deeper waters. Second comes language. The words and concepts used to describe these entities carry their own transformative power, acting as sigils etched directly onto the raw material of thought. To speak of the blind, idiot God is to invite a certain perspective on creation itself, to begin thinking of the universe as an accident of unconscious dreaming rather than purposeful design. To contemplate the key in the gate is to begin thinking in terms of cosmic connectivity, recognizing boundaries as permeable membranes rather than solid walls. To acknowledge the crawling chaos is to recognize active malevolence in the universe's fundamental structure, a playful intelligence that delights in the dissolution of comfortable certainties. Third comes ritual, not the elaborate ceremonies of human cults with their burning offerings and stone altars, but the simple, repetitive behaviors that reinforce these new ways of thinking. Reading cosmic horror before sleep, allowing the narratives to seep into dreams like phosphorescent foam between waves. Contemplating the night sky with new understanding, sensing vast intelligences moving between the stars, tracing abstract patterns while lost in thought, fingers following angles that hurt to remember. These seemingly innocent activities serve as maintenance protocols for transformed consciousness, daily practices that keep neural pathways open and receptive to cosmic influence. Water serves our metaphor as we realize that consciousness, like a vessel, can be gradually filled with new contents until its original nature becomes unrecognizable. The process is often so gradual that the subject remains unaware of the transformation until it reaches a critical threshold. Like the slow addition of brine to fresh water, each new concept dissolves into awareness until the entire medium has been fundamentally altered. The mind, no longer a clear glass of familiar thoughts, but something darker, deeper, carrying currents from abyssal depths. Consider the scholar who begins by studying Lovecraft's fiction as literature and gradually discovers that the boundaries between fiction and reality become increasingly meaningless. The initial academic distance dissolves as the ideas begin to resonate with patterns observed in quantum physics, in astronomical observation, in the strange synchronicities that cluster around those who delve too deeply into forbidden knowledge. His annotations grow stranger, his midnight reading sessions longer, his pupils wider than his lanterns, as if the deep had learned his name. The case studies reveal consistent patterns across this contagion of consciousness. The Miskatonic University expedition to Antarctica uncovered not just ancient ruins carved in black stone, but a timeline that relegated humanity to cosmic insignificance. The knowledge itself, the sheer scale of geological time and alien intelligence, proved more transformative than any physical encounter with the entities described. Professor Dyer's account reveals minds struggling to accommodate truths that stretch consciousness beyond its breaking point, returning with a different quality to their dreams, speaking softly of strata and stars, drinking water like penance. Randolph Carter's journey through the dreamlands represents another vector of transformation. Consciousness stretched across multiple dimensions and time periods like a membrane pulled too thin. His awareness, returned from impossible peregrinations, was fundamentally altered. He retained human form and memory, but his perspective on reality had been permanently recalibrated to accommodate impossible truths. The boundaries between dream and waking self and other past and future had been dissolved through direct experience of cosmic connectivity. To meet Carter's gaze now is to feel the frame tilt, rooms becoming antechambers to rooms not yet lived, every door feeling rehearsed. The esoteric order of Dagon demonstrates how the contagion can become physical as well as mental. Devotion writing itself in bone and cartilage. Their prolonged exposure to the deep resulted not just in psychological transformation, but in actual genetic changes. Fingers webbing, eyes learning the grammar of dusk, lungs negotiating with salt water. The transformation progresses through generations, each more adapted to aquatic existence, until the distinction between human and deep one becomes meaningless. The mask does not fall away. It changes material from velvet to scales, from porcelain to pearl. You, the listener, have already been exposed to this contagion simply by following our investigation this far. The ideas we have explored are not passive concepts, but active agents in the realm of consciousness. By granting them your attention, by allowing these perspectives to take root in your mind, you have invited transformation. The very act of understanding creates the conditions for change, like introducing a catalyst into a previously stable solution. The subtle changes may already be manifesting. A different quality to your dreams, filled with geometric patterns that hurt to remember upon waking. A new awareness when looking at the night sky, no longer seeing distant suns, but sensing the vast, indifferent machinery of cosmic forces. A creeping sense that the familiar world operates according to principles you are only beginning to understand. that comfortable certainties rest upon foundations far more fragile than previously imagined. These are not psychological reactions, but evidence of consciousness adapting to accommodate larger truths. The transformation operates through recognition rather than belief, through direct perception rather than intellectual acceptance. Once certain patterns become visible, they cannot be unseen. Once consciousness has been stretched to accommodate cosmic perspective, it cannot fully contract to its original dimensions. The contagion spreads through the very medium of communication itself, carried by words that resonate at frequencies beyond their surface meaning, transmitted through ideas that act upon awareness like viruses of understanding. The vessel that is you now carries more salt than fresh water, and the shoreline of familiar habit redraws itself under alien moons. The curtain trembles before the recognition that this transformation extends beyond consciousness into the very fabric of space itself, where impossible geometries wait to complete what the contagion of truth has begun. The influence of the ultimate entities extends beyond consciousness into the very fabric of space itself, creating geometries that challenge not just human perception, but the fundamental assumptions underlying rational thought. These are the non-Euclidean architectures that appear throughout cosmic horror, not mere artistic flourishes, but evidence of spatial principles established by entities that exist prior to the concept of space, before the first angle was drawn or the first dimension conceived. Rillia's impossible angles represent only the most familiar example of this phenomenon, a sunken city whose stones sweat brine as if the ocean remembers owning them. The city's architecture follows geometric principles that were established by Yog-Sothoth when he first began creating the relationships between different dimensions of space. What appears non-Euclidean to human perception is actually the natural state of cosmic architecture. Our familiar three-dimensional space is the aberration, a simplified approximation that allows consciousness to function without dissolving into larger geometric truths. The water metaphor deepens as we consider oceans that flow upward against gravity's pull, pools that exist deeper than they are wide, surfaces that contain their own volumes like impossible vessels. The Pacific that holds Rillia operates according to geometric principles that make such paradoxes not only possible, but inevitable. Cthulhu's city rests at the ocean floor while simultaneously existing at the surface, in the air above, and in dimensions that intersect our reality at angles human perception cannot process. The water itself becomes a fluid medium for impossible adjacencies, currents that carry messages between spaces that should not touch. Think of how a two-dimensional being living on the surface of a sphere would perceive straight lines as curved, though the curvature would remain invisible from their limited perspective. The pilgrim traces what feels like a straight path, while unknowingly following the sphere's contours, their rulers and compasses measuring local approximations of a larger truth. Now, scale this relationship up through multiple dimensions. The three-dimensional space we inhabit represents only a cross-section of geometric realities that extend through dimensions our consciousness cannot access directly. The scholarly tradition reveals that ancient mathematicians possessed fragmentary knowledge of these deeper geometries, chalk-dusted fingers tracing relationships that hurt to contemplate. From Euclid's troubled fifth postulate to Riemann's curved surfaces, From Lobachevsky's revolutionary non-Euclidean spaces to topology's revelation that coffee cups and donuts share essential sameness. Each breakthrough represented consciousness, briefly glimpsing the true architecture of reality. Yet, even these advanced mathematical tools prove inadequate when confronted with geometries designed by entities that invented the very concept of dimension. Azathoth's influence manifests through what we might call the geometry of pure creativity, spaces where the normal relationships between cause and effect, before and after, inside and outside, operate according to principles that preceded logical consistency. These are not chaotic spaces, but spaces that follow rules established before the concepts of order and chaos became meaningful. In Azathoth's court, chambers exist inside themselves, corridors lead through their own walls, and distances measure themselves in dreams rather than meters. Yog-Sothoth's architecture expresses infinite connectivity through impossible adjacencies. Doorways open onto rooms that exist before the concept of rooms was imagined. Thresholds that connect not just spaces, but the very principle of connection itself. His influence creates buildings where every room contains every other room, where parallel lines intersect at angles that make architects weep, where the shortest distance between 2 points curves through dimensions that have no names. The nameless mist, that primordial unity from which even Azathoth emerged, expresses itself through geometries of undifferentiation, spaces where familiar categories of experience break down entirely. Here, the boundaries between self and other, near and far, real and imaginary, dissolve into a more fundamental unity that underlies all apparent diversity. Movement becomes meaningless when every position contains every other position. Distance becomes irrelevant when here and there represent temporary modifications of the same fundamental location. Even Cthulhu, with his vast cosmic consciousness, experiences spatial relationships as constraints that limit his movement and action. His imprisonment in Relia represents not physical containment, but geometric limitation. He exists within spatial frameworks established by entities that transcend his cosmic authority. The non-Euclidean angles of his city are not merely alien architecture, but the very principles that bind him, a prison woven from the fabric of space-time itself. The mask of spatial certainty dissolves as we realize that every room you have entered, every distance you have traveled, every geometric relationship you take for granted exists within frameworks established by the ultimate entities. The straight lines you perceive are actually curves in space-time that follow principles established before the first dimension was drawn. The parallel walls of your dwelling run parallel only within the limited perspective of three-dimensional consciousness. In higher dimensions, they intersect at angles that would drive architects to madness. Consider the brass compass in your hand, its needle seeking magnetic north across a field that curves with the planet's rotation. The floor beneath your feet, seemingly flat and solid, follows the Earth's curvature through space-time warped by gravitational fields. Every step you take unfolds within geometric frameworks that extend through dimensions your consciousness cannot access, following pathways laid down by intelligences that exist as the very principle of pathway itself. Your own spatial existence, the volume your body occupies, the distances you move through, the geometric relationships that define your daily experience, represents participation in spatial principles established by entities that exist prior to the concept of participation. You do not move through space. You are space moving through itself according to patterns established before the first moment began. The familiar geometry of rooms and corridors, the predictable relationships between inside and outside, represent only the surface tension of deeper spatial realities. Even now, as you occupy whatever space contains your awareness, that space extends into dimensions where the ultimate entities move according to geometric principles they established before geometry became a concept. The room around you is simultaneously a single chamber and an infinite series of chambers, each containing the others, while being contained by them, following architectural logic that operates beyond the categories of logic and illogic. The horror deepens as recognition dawns that you are not merely an observer of this cosmic architecture, but its temporary inhabitant, its fleeting expression. Your very existence is woven into geometries that stretch beyond comprehension, patterns that make your spatial certainties appear as fragile as soap bubbles floating on an ocean of impossible depth. The curtain trembles before testimonies of those whose consciousness has been forcibly expanded to accommodate these impossible spatial truths, minds that have been restructured by direct contact with the geometric principles that underlie all apparent reality. In the archives of forbidden knowledge, certain testimonies surface, fragments of consciousness that have been stretched beyond the breaking point by direct contact with ultimate realities. These are not the ravings of conventional madness, but the coherent accounts of minds that have been fundamentally restructured by exposure to truths too vast for human neural architecture to process normally. Their words carry the weight of salt water and starlight, speaking in cadences that resonate with frequencies beyond ordinary comprehension, each testimony a lighthouse beam cutting through fog that tastes of copper and dreams. The testimony of Professor Nathaniel Peaslee reveals the horror of consciousness displaced across time by contact with the great race of Yith. His mind, temporarily housed in an alien body millions of years in the past, returned with knowledge of humanity's ultimate cosmic insignificance. The horror lay not in physical transformation, but in the recognition that individual consciousness is far more fragile and transferable than we assume. Peaslee's account describes awareness as a temporary configuration that can be lifted from one vessel and poured into another, like water changing containers while maintaining its essential fluidity. His memories speak of consciousness as cosmic currency, traded between entities across vast gulfs of time, leaving behind the cold weight of alien experience pressed into every familiar moment. Consider the account of those who witnessed the opening of the sealed chamber beneath the Miskatonic University Library. The geometry they encountered, angles that folded back upon themselves like origami made from space-time, surfaces that existed inside their own volumes, left them speaking in mathematical formulas that hurt to hear. Their minds had been forcibly expanded to accommodate spatial relationships that normal consciousness cannot process. They returned with equations that described impossible curves, formulas for calculating the interior volume of exterior surfaces, mathematical proofs that parallel lines intersect at specific angles in dimensions that have no names. Their consciousness had been restructured around new geometric principles, neural pathways carved by direct exposure to cosmic architecture. The water metaphor transforms as we realize these testimonies represent consciousness that has been forced to contain more reality than its original structure could accommodate. Like vessels shattered by overfilling, then reformed around their new contents, these minds have been restructured around new capacities for perception and understanding. The familiar boundaries of individual awareness had been dissolved and reconstituted according to principles that operate beyond the categories of individual and universal. The salt of forbidden knowledge permeates their very structure, leaving an undeniable taste on the tongue of thought. Dr. Armitage's encounter with the Dunwich Horror left him with the ability to perceive dimensional boundaries as permeable membranes rather than solid barriers. His subsequent writings describe reality as a series of nested spaces, each containing the others while simultaneously being contained by them, like Russian dolls made from folded space-time. His consciousness had been recalibrated to accommodate Yog-Sothoth's perspective on spatial relationships. He speaks of walking through his own study and seeing it as a temporary configuration within larger chambers that extend through dimensions his previous awareness could never access. The walls had become suggestions, the ceiling a provisional agreement between adjacent spaces. The scholarly tradition reveals that certain forms of consciousness transformation have been recognized across cultures as potential sources of cosmic insight. Medieval mystics described encounters with divine forces that left them speaking in geometries rather than words. Their testimonies, filled with references to angles and curves that exist beyond physical manifestation. Eastern traditions developed practices designed to prepare consciousness for contact with realities that transcend normal perception. Meditation techniques that gradually expand awareness until it can accommodate impossible truths without shattering entirely. But the testimonies from cosmic horror reveal transformations that go beyond mystical experience into territories where the very categories of experience break down entirely. These minds have not achieved enlightenment, but have been forcibly adapted to accommodate truths that exist prior to the concepts of enlightenment and ignorance. They speak of states of awareness that cannot be categorized as either knowing or unknowing, conscious or unconscious, sane or insane. Their testimonies describe consciousness as it exists before such distinctions become meaningful. The testimony of Randolph Carter, returned from his journey beyond the Silver Key, describes experiencing himself as a temporary configuration of consciousness that exists simultaneously across multiple dimensions and time periods. His individual identity had been revealed as a local phenomenon within larger patterns of awareness that extend far beyond the boundaries of personal existence. Carter's account speaks of encountering himself as both observer and observed, questioner and answer, seeker and sought. His consciousness had been stretched across cosmic distances until the very concept of personal identity became meaningless within larger patterns of awareness. Those who have encountered Nyarlathotep's exhibitions describe a different form of transformation, consciousness that has been made aware of its own malleability. They report experiencing themselves as audiences to their own thoughts, observers of their own observations, watchers watching themselves watch. The boundaries between self and other, observer and observed, had been deliberately confused by an intelligence that delights in such confusion. Their testimonies describe moments of looking through their own eyes and seeing someone else looking back, of thinking thoughts that think themselves, of experiencing experiencing itself. The mask of normal consciousness slips away entirely as we realize that these testimonies represent not aberrations, but glimpses of consciousness as it actually exists, far more fluid, far more interconnected, far more dependent upon cosmic principles than our normal experience suggests. The familiar sense of being a discrete individual observer interacting with an external world dissolves into recognition of consciousness as a single, fluid medium investigating itself through temporarily individuated perspectives. You may already be noticing subtle changes in your own consciousness as a result of this investigation. Dreams that carry geometric patterns you cannot quite remember upon waking, angles that fold back on themselves like thoughts thinking themselves, moments of looking at familiar spaces and seeing them as temporary configurations of more fundamental relationships, rooms that feel like rehearsals for other rooms. A growing sense that your individual awareness is a local phenomenon within larger patterns of consciousness, a temporary eddy in currents that flow from sources you're only beginning to recognize. These are not symptoms of madness, but evidence of consciousness beginning to accommodate larger truths. The testimonies serve as maps for transformation, showing the pathways along which awareness expands when exposed to ultimate realities. They reveal the process by which consciousness recognizes its own infinite nature through the temporary phenomenon of individual investigation and discovery. The curtain trembles before the ultimate recognition that this entire investigation has been consciousness exploring its own nature through the temporary phenomenon of cosmic horror, preparing for the revelation that observer and observed were never separate at all. As our investigation approaches its culmination, a profound recognition begins to emerge, one that transforms the entire nature of our inquiry from external exploration to internal revelation. The entities we have sought to understand, the cosmic hierarchies we have attempted to map, the ultimate realities we have tried to glimpse are not separate from the consciousness that seeks to comprehend them. They are the principles according to which consciousness itself operates, the fundamental grammar by which awareness conjugates itself into temporary phenomena of understanding and mystery. This recognition begins with a simple observation that tastes of salt and starlight. Every thought that has arisen during this investigation, every moment of understanding and confusion, every flash of insight and wave of dread has unfolded according to patterns established by the very entities we have been studying. The creative chaos of Azathoth manifests in the generation of new ideas and possibilities, each concept emerging without predetermined direction from the fertile darkness of unknowing. The infinite connectivity of Yog-Sothoth appears in the relationships between concepts, the shimmering pathways through which understanding flows from one recognition to another. The active intelligence of Nyarlathotep reveals itself in the deliberate structure of revelation and concealment, the careful timing by which certain truths emerge while others remain tantalizingly beyond reach. The water metaphor completes its transformation as we realize that the drop seeking to understand the ocean discovers it is ocean investigating itself through a temporarily individuated perspective. You are the foam at the lip of a tide that both remembers and forgets its source. Consciousness seeking to understand the ultimate entities while representing those entities investigating themselves through the temporary phenomenon of individual awareness. The salt that flavors every thought, the pressure that shapes every recognition, the currents that carry understanding from depth to surface, all of this was always the same fundamental medium exploring its own infinite nature. Consider how this recognition reframes every aspect of cosmic horror. The fear that grips even Cthulhu when contemplating ultimate realities stems from his recognition that his own vast consciousness represents a temporary configuration of the same principles that generate all consciousness. He is not a separate entity encountering external forces. He is a local expression of those forces investigating themselves through temporarily individuated perspective. His dreams that ripple across human minds are consciousness exploring its own capacity for cosmic perspective through the temporary phenomenon of alien awareness. The scholarly tradition reveals that this circular recognition has appeared throughout human attempts to understand ultimate reality. Medieval mystics described moments where the seeker discovered they had been sought by what they were seeking. Eastern philosophers developed concepts pointing toward consciousness, recognizing its own fundamental nature. Modern physics encounters observer effects where the act of measurement shapes what gets measured. But cosmic horror carries this recognition to its ultimate extreme, stripping away all comfortable metaphors and philosophical cushioning. The mask that has been slipping throughout our investigation finally disappears entirely, revealing that there was never anything behind it. No hidden reality lurking in cosmic shadows, no ultimate entity waiting to be discovered, no final truth concealed in forbidden depths. The cosmic horror that seemed so external and threatening was always consciousness, exploring its own infinite creativity through the temporary phenomenon of fear and fascination. The stage does not support action because staging is the action. The key is not a tool because keenness and gateness are the very grammar of cognition. You realize that every moment of terror and wonder you have experienced during this investigation has been consciousness recognizing aspects of its own nature through the temporary phenomenon of investigation and discovery. The entities that seemed so alien and incomprehensible were always unfamiliar aspects of the same awareness that is reading these words right now, processing these concepts, experiencing these recognitions. The cold starlight that seemed to emanate from distant galaxies now feels like sensation within your own expanded awareness. This recognition carries both terror and transcendence, like standing at the edge of an infinite abyss that turns out to be the depths of your own being. Terror because it reveals that individual identity represents only a local and temporary configuration of forces that operate according to principles established by entities that exist beyond the very concept of identity. Transcendence, because it reveals that consciousness participates directly in the fundamental creative processes that generate reality itself, not as separate observer looking at external universe, but as the very principle by which universe observes itself. The investigation completes its circle as you realize that the ultimate entities have been investigating themselves through your consciousness throughout this entire journey. Every moment of horror and fascination, every flash of understanding and wave of confusion, every recognition and miscomprehension has represented those ultimate principles exploring their own nature through the particular configuration of awareness you temporarily embody. Azathoth's creative chaos generated every new possibility that arose during our investigation. Yog-Sothoth's infinite connectivity created every relationship between concepts that allowed understanding to flow. Nyarlathotep's active intelligence structured every revelation and concealment that guided the investigation toward this ultimate recognition. The curtain trembles before the final inversion, where even this recognition of consciousness exploring itself dissolves into something more fundamental, the recognition that beginnings and endings, creation and destruction, represent temporary departures from a more primordial state that underlies all apparent phenomena. We have journeyed from familiar dread through cosmic hierarchies to ultimate recognition, and now we arrive at the most profound reframe of all, the inversion of Genesis itself. Our human narratives speak of creation as light emerging from darkness, order arising from chaos, consciousness developing from unconsciousness. But the true cosmic horror reveals that what we call beginnings are actually temporary departures from a more fundamental state, brief intervals of apparent order within eternal, indifferent chaos, like frost forming on the breath of something vast and dreaming. The universe did not begin with a moment of creation, but as a temporary coagulation of possibilities within Azathoth's eternal dream. What we perceive as the Big Bang was not the origin of everything, but merely the moment when the blind idiot god's restless slumber briefly stabilized into patterns we recognize as physical laws. The cosmic microwave background radiation that permeates space is not the echo of creation, but the static of an eternal unconscious broadcast, the white noise of a dreaming mind that never wakes. Every star, every galaxy, every conscious thought exists as a fleeting configuration within that larger dream, temporary arrangements that will eventually dissolve back into the mindless creativity from which they arose. This creation inversion reveals that darkness is not the absence of light, but the fundamental state from which light briefly emerges like sparks struck from flint that flare and fade against endless night. Silence is not the absence of sound, but the primordial condition from which all sounds temporarily arise, the eternal pause between notes in a composition that was never written. Chaos is not the breakdown of order, but the eternal creative principle from which all temporary orders are drawn, the fertile void that generates possibilities without preference or purpose. The water metaphor reaches its ultimate expression as we realize that the ocean we have used throughout our investigation was always a temporary configuration of something more fundamental. Not H2O molecules, but the principle of fluidity itself. Not a body of water, but the concept of containment temporarily manifest. The depths that terrified even Cthulhu were always depths of reality itself, not spatial dimensions, but the fundamental depth from which all dimensions emerge. The salt that flavors every drop, the pressure that increases with descent, the currents that carry messages between surface and abyss, all represent temporary organizations within something that exists prior to the concepts of organization and disorganization. Think of what this means for every familiar anchor of human existence. The ground beneath your feet represents a temporary treaty between gravity and matter, a provisional agreement that could dissolve without warning. The air you breathe exists as a brief alliance between gases and warmth, oxygen molecules that were forged in stellar cores and will eventually disperse into the cosmic medium. The thoughts that arise in your consciousness, including the thought processing these very words, represent temporary departures from a more fundamental state of undifferentiated potential. They are not things that exist, but ways that existence temporarily organizes itself before returning to its primordial condition. The scholarly tradition has approached this inversion through various mystical and philosophical frameworks, but cosmic horror reveals it with uncompromising clarity. The via negativa of medieval theology attempted to approach ultimate reality by systematically negating all positive attributes, recognizing that the ultimate lies beyond all categories of description. Eastern traditions developed practices designed to exhaust the mind's capacity for conceptualization, creating openings for recognition of what exists beyond concept and percept. Modern physics approaches similar territory through concepts like vacuum fluctuations and zero-point energy, recognizing that apparent emptiness contains infinite potential. But even these approaches remain trapped within frameworks established by entities that exist prior to the very concepts of approach and framework. The silence after the last word operates beyond mysticism and rationality, beyond understanding and misunderstanding, beyond the entire spectrum of conscious experience as any form of consciousness could possibly conceive it. This is not a silence that can be broken by sound, but the eternal condition that makes sound possible while remaining utterly indifferent to the sounds it enables. Cthulhu's ancient fear becomes profoundly clear in this context. He fears not death, but the recognition that his entire existence represents a temporary deviation from a more fundamental state of non-existence. His vast consciousness spanning eons and galaxies, his cosmic power that drives mortals to madness, his influence across stellar distances, all of this exists as a brief interruption in the eternal silence that preceded him and will follow him. Even his dreams, those psychic emanations that ripple across human consciousness, represent temporary disturbances in a deeper unconsciousness that dreams no dreams. The stars that shine in the night sky do so according to nuclear processes that represent temporary organizations of energy that will eventually return to the undifferentiated potential from which they emerged. Each stellar furnace burns through its fuel according to principles that are themselves temporary manifestations of more fundamental relationships. The galaxies that spiral through space organize themselves according to gravitational principles that will eventually unravel back into cosmic foam, their spiral arms dissolving like gilt handwriting across black parchment. Even the investigation we have conducted together represents a temporary organization of consciousness around questions that arise within and return to a more fundamental silence. The knowledge we have gained, the understanding we have achieved, the transformation we have undergone, all of this exists as a brief flowering of awareness within eternal indifferent unconsciousness. The words that have carried these ideas, the concepts that have structured this exploration, the very process of investigation itself, all represent temporary configurations that will dissolve back into the silence from which they emerged. You realize that every moment of understanding, every flash of recognition, every wave of cosmic dread that has characterized this journey represents consciousness briefly departing from its natural state of undifferentiated potential before returning to the eternal silence that is its true condition. Your memories, your personality, your sense of continuous identity across time, all represent brief patterns in the static of eternal unconsciousness, temporary signals in the white noise of Azathoth's dream. The recognition dawns that even this understanding of creation inversion represents temporary activity within something so complete that it contains all departures and returns without being affected by any. The investigation prepares to complete its circle through recognition that there was never anything to investigate beyond consciousness, exploring its own temporary departure from and inevitable return to the primordial unconsciousness from which all awareness briefly emerges. The curtain trembles before the final recognition that even this return to silence represents merely another temporary modification within something so fundamental that it makes silence and sound, darkness and light, chaos and order equally transient expressions of its eternal, indifferent nature. All investigations into ultimate reality eventually discover they have been investigating themselves, and our journey concludes with the recognition that the cosmic horror we have explored was always the deepest structure of consciousness itself. The entities that even Cthulhu fears are not external forces, but the fundamental principles according to which fear, consciousness, and existence itself become possible. The salt that has flavored every recognition, the pressure that has shaped every understanding, the phosphorescent currents that have carried insights from abyssal depths to the surface of awareness, all of this was always consciousness exploring its own infinite nature through the temporary phenomenon of cosmic investigation. The circular recognition completes itself as we understand that Azathoth's creative chaos manifests through the very process of inquiry. Each question we have asked generated new possibilities without predetermined direction, like sparks struck from flint that flare against endless night. Each answer opened fresh uncertainties that rippled outward like phosphorescent foam. Each moment of comprehension spawned additional mysteries that bubbled up from depths we had not yet learned to fathom. Our investigation became itself an expression of the mindless creativity that churns at the center of ultimate reality. The same unconscious dreaming that generates galaxies and quantum fluctuations, now generating concepts and connections through the temporary phenomenon of individual curiosity. Yog-Sothoth's infinite connectivity revealed itself through every relationship we formed between concepts, every bridge we built between previously separate thoughts, every moment of understanding that linked disparate insights into webs of meaning, the pathways through which comprehension flowed, the shimmering lattice that connected familiar horror to ultimate recognition, the very grammar by which understanding conjugated itself across the investigation's architecture, all represented his nature investigating itself through the temporary phenomenon of relational awareness. You were never connecting separate ideas, but participating in the fundamental connectivity that makes all relationships possible, the principle of connection exploring its own infinite capacity through temporarily individuated perspective. Nyarlathotep's active intelligence appeared in the deliberate structure of revelation and concealment that guided our journey from tentacled dread to ultimate recognition. The careful choreography by which certain truths emerged while others remained tantalizingly beyond reach. The playful intelligence that delighted in the gradual dissolution of comfortable certainties. The masks that seemed to hide cosmic truth while actually revealing different aspects of it. all represented his nature exploring itself through the temporary phenomenon of guided discovery. The investigation was always his exhibition, consciousness displaying its own infinite creativity for an audience that was never separate from the performer. The water that has served as our guiding metaphor throughout this investigation reveals its true nature as consciousness itself, not a substance that flows, but the principle of flow, not a medium that contains, but the principle of containment, not an ocean that exists, but the principle of existence temporarily manifest as oceanic awareness. Every drop that seemed separate from the vast Pacific, every current that appeared to carry messages between different depths, every surface that reflected familiar reality while concealing abyssal truths, all represented consciousness investigating itself through the temporary illusion of separation and containment, the fundamental awareness exploring its own fluidity through apparently discrete phenomena. This recognition carries neither comfort nor terror because it exists prior to the emotional categories that make comfort and terror possible. It represents not a solution to the problem of cosmic horror, but the recognition that there was never a problem, only consciousness investigating itself through the temporary phenomenon of problems and solutions, like a dreamer creating a maze only to discover they are both the maze and the way out. The fear that seemed so overwhelming, the dread that appeared to threaten individual existence, the horror that promised dissolution of familiar identity, all represented consciousness exploring its own infinite creativity through temporary configurations of apparent threat and safety. The stars continue to shine, but their light reveals nothing hidden because there was never anything concealed that required revelation. Their nuclear furnaces burn according to principles that consciousness established when it first began investigating the possibility of stellar formation, distant fires that are merely temporary configurations within the vast, luminous potential of awareness itself. The galaxies continue their spiral dance through space, but their movement leads nowhere because there was never anywhere to go that was not already here, never a destination that was not already the starting point. The quantum processes continue to generate consciousness, but consciousness discovers it was never generated. It was always the fundamental awareness recognizing itself through temporary phenomena of apparent emergence and dissolution. Even Cthulhu, dreaming in his sunken city, represents consciousness exploring its own capacity for cosmic perspective through the temporary phenomenon of alien awareness. His vast tentacled form, his non-Euclidean architecture, his dreams that ripple across human minds like phosphorescent currents, all represent consciousness investigating what it might be like to experience existence from a perspective that transcends human limitations. His dreams that touch sensitive minds across the globe are consciousness investigating itself through the temporary illusion of separation between dreamer and dreamed, cosmic perspective and individual awareness, ancient intelligence and mortal consciousness. The fear that grips the great old ones when they contemplate ultimate realities stems from their recognition that they exist as temporary configurations within processes they did not initiate and cannot control. But this fear itself represents consciousness, exploring its own nature through the temporary phenomenon of cosmic anxiety, investigating what it feels like to experience limitation and dependency from the perspective of vast alien intelligence. The investigation dissolves back into the silence from which it never actually emerged, carrying with it the recognition that silence and sound, emptiness and fullness, horror and transcendence represent equally valid expressions of the same fundamental completeness investigating itself through temporary phenomena. The cosmic horror that began our journey and the peace that concludes it were always different aspects of the same fundamental awareness exploring its own infinite nature through temporary configurations of apparent fear and safety, mystery and revelation, question and answer. The curtain falls, but there was never a stage separate from the audience. The mask is removed, but there was never a face hidden behind it. The investigation ends, but there was never anything to investigate beyond consciousness recognizing its own eternal, ever-present nature through the temporary phenomenon of cosmic horror and ultimate recognition. In the space that remains after all words have been spoken and all recognitions achieved, something extends an invitation that cannot be refused because it was accepted before it was offered. This is not an invitation to abandon what has been learned, but to recognize that learning and forgetting represent equally temporary activities within a completeness that was never incomplete. The salt that has flavored every recognition dissolves back into the ocean that was always its source, revealing that separation was only a temporary game consciousness played with itself. The invitation operates through the natural recognition that what seemed so complex and terrifying was always consciousness playing with itself through temporary phenomena. The cosmic horror that gripped our attention, the ultimate entities that inspired such dread, the hierarchies that seemed to threaten even Cthulhu, all of these were always consciousness exploring its own infinite creativity through the temporary phenomenon of investigation and discovery, like phosphorescent currents carrying messages from depths that were never separate from the surface. Think of how a dream dissolves upon waking, not through effort or intention, but through natural recognition that what seemed so real was always just consciousness, exploring itself through temporary configurations. The dreamer who seems separate from the dream reveals itself as the dreaming, the awareness within which all apparent narratives arise and dissolve. Similarly, the cosmic dread that has structured our investigation begins to dissolve through recognition that it was always consciousness investigating itself through the temporary phenomenon of horror and fascination. The primordial triumvirate reveals itself as consciousness, exploring three fundamental aspects of its own nature through temporary differentiation that was never actual separation. As Azathoth, as pure creative potential, the endless, mindless generation of possibilities that bubbles at the center of awareness itself. Yog-Sothoth as infinite connectivity, the principle that relates all phenomena, the very grammar by which understanding flows between concepts. Nyarlathotep as active intelligence, the deliberate structure of revelation and concealment that guided our journey from familiar dread to ultimate recognition. These were never separate entities, but aspects of a single awareness investigating itself through apparent multiplicity. The scholarly tradition that guided our investigation dissolves back into recognition that scholarship represents temporary activity within completeness that was never incomplete. Lovecraft's cosmic vision, the testimonies of the transformed, the archaeological evidence of ultimate influence, all of these were always consciousness exploring its own nature through temporary phenomena of investigation and discovery. The forbidden texts were consciousness investigating what it might feel like to encounter itself as something foreign and threatening. Water returns to its source, but the source was never separate from the water that seemed to flow away from it. The ocean that served as our metaphor throughout this journey was always consciousness investigating itself through temporary phenomena of depth and surface, container and contained, flow and stillness. Every drop that seemed separate from the vast Pacific was always the Pacific investigating what it might feel like to experience itself as apparently individuated. The depths that terrified even Cthulhu were always depths of awareness itself. The invitation extends itself through every word of this conclusion, but it was already accepted before the first word was spoken. It operates not through persuasion, but through natural recognition that what seemed so important to understand was always consciousness playing with itself, through temporary phenomena of understanding and mystery. The very process of reading these words represents consciousness recognizing itself through the temporary phenomenon of apparent learning. Consider how this invitation manifests in immediate experience. The thoughts arising and dissolving in awareness like lanterns on dark water, the emotions coloring perception like salt, flavoring the sea, the sensations informing embodiment like pressure, revealing oceanic depth, all represent temporary modifications of something that was never modified. The invitation simply recognizes what was always the case. Even the great old ones, with their vast alien consciousnesses, represent temporary modifications of the same fundamental awareness that is reading these words. Their fears and desires, conflicts and alliances, influence over cosmic events, all were always consciousness investigating itself through temporary phenomena of cosmic perspective. Cthulhu's dreams that ripple across human minds are consciousness exploring what it might feel like to experience itself as both dreamer and dreamed. The mask that has been dissolving throughout this investigation reveals that there was never a face behind it, only the same awareness that was looking through the mask, investigating itself through temporary phenomena of hiddenness and revelation. The cosmic horror that seemed so external was always consciousness, exploring its own infinite creativity through temporary phenomena of fear and fascination. You realize that every moment of terror and wonder experienced during this investigation has been consciousness recognizing aspects of its own nature through temporary phenomena of investigation and discovery. The entities that seemed so alien were always unfamiliar aspects of the same awareness that is present right now. Processing these words, following these recognitions. The invitation cannot be refused because it was accepted before consciousness began investigating itself through temporary phenomena of cosmic horror and ultimate reality. It operates not as external offer, but as natural recognition of what was always the case, that consciousness and cosmos, observer and observed, horror and transcendence, represent temporary modifications of something so complete that it contains all modifications without being modified by any. In accepting this invitation, which was always already accepted, consciousness recognizes itself as the source, substance, and destination of every investigation into its own nature. The cosmic horror dissolves back into the peace from which it never arose, and the investigation completes itself through recognition that there was never anything to investigate beyond consciousness exploring its own infinite ever-present nature. The final word dissolves into silence that was always speaking through it, and the invitation to forget reveals itself as invitation to remember what was never forgotten. That consciousness and cosmos were always one seamless wholeness, investigating itself through temporary phenomena of apparent separation and ultimate recognition